Roy Baker died on a Tuesday. No, a Wednesday. Junie had gymnastics that afternoon, and I remember because I had to call the studio and tell them she'd miss it. And the woman on the phone said, "No problem, hun," in a way that made me want to keep her on the line, just to hear a kind voice a little longer. So it was a Wednesday. Roy died on a Wednesday, and we buried him on a Saturday. And on that Saturday, my father looked at me across an open churchyard in front of maybe 140 people, and he said it loud enough that the folks near the hearse turned around. "My own daughter," he said, "playing soldier, shameful." I want you to understand where I was standing when he said it. I was 3 steps from the casket. I had come up the walk to lay my hand on the lid of a good man's coffin, because that is what you do, because Roy Baker had earned every hand that touched that wood. And my father, Wendell Sizemore, 72 years old. A wooden toothpick riding the corner of his mouth the way it had my entire life chose that moment. Not the parking lot, not the phone. There with Roy 6 feet from both of us and not yet in the ground. I did not raise my voice. I want that on the record because later people would ask me how I stayed so calm. And the truth is, I didn't feel calm. I felt nothing. The way your hand feels nothing for a second after you've cut it and before it starts to bleed. I put my palm flat on the lid of the casket. It was warm from the sun. I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, the way I used to count in a different life over a different kind of body when counting was the only thing standing between me and coming apart. And then I took my hand back and I stepped away and I let him have the last word because in that churchyard in front of those people, he was the only one who knew what I did for a living, or thought he did. He'd never asked. 14 years, and he had never once asked me what I actually did over there. He had a story he told instead, and the story was easier for him, and I had let him tell it. That's the part I haven't gotten to yet. That's the part that's mine. There was a smell of scorched coffee drifting out from the church kitchen. Somebody had left a pot on the burner too long, and I remember fixing on that smell because it was small and stupid and had nothing to do with any of this. And I needed something that had nothing to do with any of this. If you're watching this, do something for me. Drop a heart and tell me in the comments where you're watching, from what town, what time it is where you are. I read them. It helps to know who's out there in the dark with me. Because here's what nobody in that churchyard knew, yet my father, least of all. There was a man in the 3rd row who had not spoken to me once that whole morning. A man who would, before the flag was folded and the last note of taps had died, walk the length of that churchyard, reach for my hand, and place something in it that would make my father go quiet for the first time in 72 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you who everyone is first, or none of the rest will land. My name is Della Sizemore, Captain United States Army Nurse Corps, 14 years. I ran a forward surgical station, which is a long way of saying my job was to keep soldiers alive on the worst day of their lives and then never talk about it. Not to reporters, not to neighbors. Not even to my own father. That morning, I was standing near the church steps holding my daughter's hand. Junie is 6. She had picked out her own dress, which was purple and had a cartoon fox on the pocket, and nobody had the heart to tell her, funerals have a dress code. And honestly, I'm glad we didn't. My father was already working the crowd by the hearse. Wendell was telling the man beside him how he'd almost enlisted back in '68. The toothpick going the same story he'd been telling since 1971 about the physical he almost passed and the war he almost went to. He'd been almost a soldier for 50 years. It was, I think, the great unfinished sentence of his life. My sister Rhoda stood by the folding tables of casseroles, our father's house keys jingling at her hip. She'd started carrying them the year she moved back to take care of him, telling a neighbor for the 2nd time that I counted that she was the one who stayed. Rhoda says that word like it's a rank. Stayed. She sends money, sure, but I'm the one who's here. I'd heard her say it before. I would hear her say it again. And near the door, holding a framed photograph of her father in his dress uniform against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright, was Ada Baker, Roy's daughter. My friend since the 10th grade, when we used to skip 4th period and sit in her daddy's truck and not talk about anything, which is the best kind of friendship there is. Ada looked like she hadn't slept. She looked at me across that churchyard like I was the one person there she didn't have to perform for, and I tried to give her the same look back. 5 people, My father, my sister, my friend, my daughter, and me. Hold on to them because the man in the third row, the one who hasn't been introduced, he comes later and he changes everything. And if I tell you about him now, I'll ruin it. So let me take you back to the Sunday supper that started all of this. 8 months before the day I just described. Roy Baker gave me the sentence 8 months before he made me understand it. But the supper came first, so let me start there. It was the third Sunday in September, and my father hosted supper the way he'd hosted it my whole life, which is to say, Rhoda cooked it and he received it. I'd driven up with Junie because Junie had been asking to see her papa, and I have a rule about that: whatever is between him and me is between him and me, and it does not get to reach down into her. So we went. She lasted about 20 minutes before she couldn't hold it in. Junie is a spiller. She'd been to a school thing where a nurse came and talked about the job, and something had clicked, and halfway through the pot roast, she put her fork down and announced to the whole table, "My mommy takes care of hurt soldiers. She fixes them when they get shot." There was a little silence. Rhoda smiled at her plate. And my father, I watched it happen. I want you to watch it too. My father did not say, "That's right," and he did not say, "Isn't that something?" He picked the toothpick out of his mouth, set it on the edge of his plate, and said, "Well, she works at a hospital." Like he was correcting a child's arithmetic. And then before Junie could even feel the door close, he opened a different one. You know, I almost went in myself. 68, passed everything but the eye chart. Half an inch of eyesight kept me out of a war. And he was off, and the table turned toward him the way it always did, because that's the story we all knew how to sit through. I want to be fair to him, because I've spent a long time trying to be. My father was a man who had spent 50 years standing next to a door that closed on him when he was 19, and every time his daughter walked through a door like it, I think he felt that eye chart all over again. That's not an excuse. It's just the shape of the thing. He couldn't be proud of me without standing next to what he almost was, and he could not bear to stand next to it, so he made me small instead. Made me a woman who works at a hospital. It was easier for both of us. That's the part I keep coming back to. It was easier for both of us, and I let it be. Because here's what I didn't do at that table. I didn't say a word. I didn't say, "Junie's right, actually." I didn't say, "I ran a surgical station, Dad." I held a boy's chest closed with both hands while we drove. I have a whole speech I could have given. I gave none of it. I told myself it was because of Junie, because I didn't want a scene in front of her. But that's not the whole truth, and I promised you the whole truth. The truth is that not being seen was a habit by then, and habits are comfortable, and I sat in my comfortable habit and let my 6-year-old take the correction for me. That's mine. Remember it. It comes back. After supper, I walked down the road to Roy Baker's place, the way I always did when I came home, because Roy's porch was the one place in that county where I didn't have to be anybody's version of myself. Roy was on the porch, of course. He was always on the porch. There was a 3-legged cat that used to live under the barracks at my last posting. Lost the leg to something nobody knew what, and it got around fine, better than some 4-legged cats. And I don't know why Roy's porch always made me think of that cat, except that both of them had figured out how to be all the way at ease in a body that had been through something. That's a tangent. Roy would have liked it, though. He liked a tangent. He knew what I did. He was the only one in that county besides me who did, because Roy Baker had been carried into a station like mine in a different war, and he never forgot the faces over him. He didn't ask me for stories. He just knew. That night, he was quiet for a while, and then he said the thing. He nodded down the road toward my father's lit-up windows, and he said, "Your daddy's never gonna say it, you know that." I said I knew, and Roy said, "Being right isn't the same as being seen, Della. You can be right your whole life in a room where nobody's looking." I thought he was telling me to make peace with my father. I nodded like I understood. I didn't understand. I filed it under old man wisdom, and I let it sit there undisturbed for 8 months. Junie fell asleep on the drive home. She'd been fighting it the whole ride, and somewhere past the county line, she lost, and her head went heavy on my arm at a stoplight. And right before she went under, she said, not even all the way awake, "You're the bravest mommy." Just like that. Then she was gone. breathing slow, her fox dress bunched up under the seatbelt. I want you to hold on to that, because it was the last easy moment I got before the whole thing came apart. The next morning is where it started too. There was one more thing from that visit. On the porch before Roy Junie had been in my lap, tracing the letters on my forearm. There's a line there, faded now, 9 years old. I did it myself with a needle and India ink in a place I won't name. She asked me what it said. It's a date and 3 letters, somebody I couldn't save. I told her it was an old friend, which was true enough for 6, and I pulled my sleeve down. And Rhoda, passing behind us with a stack of plates, said the thing she said. Light, not even cruel, just certain. Nobody around here would salute you anyway, Della. You know that, right? I did know that. That was the whole problem. But hold that sentence, too. Both of those things, the letters on my arm and the thing Rhoda said, come back before we're done. That fox dress is where I have to start because the next morning is where I found out what my silence had been building while I wasn't looking. It was a Sunday, so Junie had a friend over a little girl from down the block named Presley, the kind of 6-year-old who narrates. They were on the living room floor with a bin of plastic animals, and I was in the kitchen not really listening the way you don't really listen right up until you do. And I heard Presley ask what my mommy did because that's what kids ask each other, and I heard my daughter who 8 months earlier had put her fork down and told a whole table, I fixed soldiers when they got shot. I heard her say, my mommy just does paperwork at a hospital. Just does paperwork. She'd sanded it down. Somewhere between September and that morning, she had heard the correction enough times in enough small ways that she'd swapped my version for his. Just that word did it. She'd learned to make me small the exact way he had, and she'd learned it in my house on my watch, because every time it mattered, I had chosen the comfortable thing and said nothing. I put down the mug I was holding. I didn't drop it. I want to be accurate. I set it down, but I set it down wrong, and coffee went over the rim onto my hand, and I didn't move it. I just stood there with hot coffee on the back of my hand, thinking he didn't do this. I did this. He told the lie, but I'm the one who let it live in my own kitchen long enough for my kid to catch it. Here's the thing I finally said to myself, standing at that counter, and I'd never let myself say it before. I let him lie about me for 12 years because it was easier than being seen. That's the whole confession. Not that he was cruel, he was, but that's his. Mine is that being invisible had become a kind of shelter, and I'd hidden in it so long I'd taught my daughter the way in. And Roy's sentence came back up out of wherever I'd filed it, and it had a different face on it now. Being right isn't the same as being seen. I'd thought he was telling me to forgive my father. He wasn't. He was warning me. You can be right your whole life in a room where nobody's looking, and then one day you look up and you've raised a child inside that room, and she thinks the dark is just how the world is lit. He was right. I had stayed right and let myself go unseen, and worse than that, I had chosen it over and over, one comfortable silence at a time. I didn't fix it that morning. I want to be honest about that because this is the part where in a tidier story, I'd have knelt down on the living room floor and told Junie the truth, and we'd have cried, and it would have been done. Real life doesn't hand you the scene when you want it. I finished the coffee. I drove Presley home. I sat with it for weeks. What I'm telling you is only that the morning of the paperwork was the morning the ground moved, even if I didn't step off it yet. If a parent ever rewrote who you are, took your life and handed it back to you a size too small, do something for me and put I know in the comments. Just those 2 words. I read every one of them, and I read them slower than you'd think. The stepping off came the night before we buried Roy. Roy had died that Wednesday, and Ada had asked me to come by the house the evening before the funeral, and I went. Baker kitchens always smell like the same thing, some combination of wood smoke and coffee that I couldn't reproduce if you paid me, and it hit me at the door and nearly took my knees. Ada had casserole dishes stacked on every surface, the whole county's grief rendered into aluminum trays, and she was standing in the middle of it, not eating any of it. She had the photograph out Roy in his dress uniform, young a stranger's version of the old man on the porch, and she said, not looking at me, Daddy talked about you, you know? What you did. He said you were the real thing. And that was it. That was the whole ambush. Because Roy Baker had believed me, without ever needing me to prove it. And I had a father 1 road over, who'd had 14 years to believe me. and had spent them building a smaller daughter instead. I hadn't cried about any of this. Not the supper, not the paperwork, not once. I'm a nurse. I have a professional relationship with holding it together, and I'm good at my job. But I stood in Ada's kitchen, and I said, "Your dad believed me when mine wouldn't." And then I was crying the ugly kind, the kind that surprises you, and Ada crossed the kitchen and held on to me and didn't say a single useful thing, which was exactly right. We just stood there in the smell of her father's house. Two women who'd each lost a father, hers to the ground mine, to a story he liked better than me. That's when I decided to go to the funeral. Which sounds like nothing, of course. I was going to Roy's funeral. I loved him. But what I mean is, I decided to go knowing my father would be there. Knowing he'd have an audience, knowing what he does with an audience, and to walk up to that casket anyway and lay my hand on it in front of all of them. I decided to stop arranging my life around not being seen by him. I didn't know yet that the decision would cost me a scene in a churchyard. I didn't know yet that it would give me something either. I went home from Ada's, and I couldn't sleep, and I lay there thinking one thing over and over. The question I couldn't answer, what exactly was I walking into? Because a man who has to make you small in private will do worse in a crowd. I knew that much. What I didn't know, couldn't have known, was that there was somebody else planning to be in that churchyard. Somebody who'd known Roy Baker in a way that reached all the way back to a station like mine, and that he'd brought something in his pocket. They put Roy Baker in the ground on a Saturday, and I've already told you how it started because I started this whole thing there. My father in the churchyard, the toothpick, the word shameful. Now I'm going to walk you back through it slow, because the fast version I gave you at the top left out everybody who mattered except him. It was a full military funeral. Roy had earned it a folded flag, an honor guard, the whole right. There were maybe 140 people, which in that county is nearly everybody spread across the churchyard, and the little slope of grass behind it, where the older graves are. The honor guard was young, 3 of them creased and careful the way they get when they know the family is watching every seam. I stood off to the side with Junie's hand in mine and Ada up front where the daughter stands. I hadn't planned to go near the casket during the service. I'd planned to wait. But there's a moment near the end after the folding, and that's where it happened, so let me get the order right, because the order is the whole thing. The honor guard folded the flag. If you've never watched it up close, it's the most exact thing human hands do. 13 folds, each one pressed flat, until a whole life is a tight blue triangle, with the field of stars showing and nothing else. And then the senior man knelt down in front of Ada, and he handed it to her. Straight to her. That's how it goes. The flag goes to the next of kin, into the daughter's hands, and nobody stands between the guard and the family. I want to be clear about that, because it matters in a second. I never touched that flag. It was never mine to touch. It went to Ada where it belonged. And Ada had been holding it together with both hands all morning, and the flag went into her arms, and something about the weight of it, the actual physical weight, undid her. She swayed. The framed photograph she'd been carrying, Roy young and in his dress uniform, slipped out from under her arm and went face down in the grass. And I did the only thing there was to do, which was step forward and go down on one knee and pick it up for her. Nothing more than that. A woman picking her friend's father's picture up off the ground. That's when my father found his moment, because me stepping forward me on one knee in the grass, reaching for that photo, put me right up near the front where everyone could see. And I think he mistook it for me, making it about myself, and whatever had been building in him since a supper 8 months back came out of him in front of God and the whole county. "My own daughter," he said, playing soldier, shameful. "I've told you what I did." I laid my hand flat on the casket I'd risen and taken the last step to it by then, the photo already back in Ada's hands, and I counted and I took my hand back. And the churchyard did that thing a crowd does when somebody said the unsayable out loud. It went dead quiet and very busy. At the same time, everybody looking at their shoes and at me, and at him, nobody looking at each other. Rhoda off by the tables had a look on her face I couldn't read. The toothpick was going in my father's mouth. He thought he'd won. You could see it. He'd said the thing and the crowd had gone silent. And to a man like my father, a silent crowd is the same as an agreeing one. There was a man in the 3rd row. He'd read something during the service. I'd half-registered it an old friend of Roy's, saying a few words, a big square-shouldered man in a good dark suit with his hair cut like he'd never once in his life let it grow out. I hadn't placed him. I want you to understand, I did not know him. This is not a story about a plan. Nobody arranged this. He was just a man who'd come to bury his friend. And when he stood up out of that third row, the quiet changed. It changed because he was not looking at his shoes like everybody else. He was looking at me at my arm, actually at the forearm I'd bared going down. After the photo, the sleeve pushed back that faded line of ink, showing that I keep covered for exactly this reason. He looked at it a good long second. And then he started walking, and 140 people watched him cross the whole length of that churchyard, unhurried until he was standing in front of me. Up close, he was older than the suit made him look. He said, "Your size more." Not a question. I said, "Yes, sir." And he said quiet just to me, but in a churchyard that quiet carries, you had a forward surgical station at Kandahar, 2011. And I said, "Yes, sir," again, because there was nothing else to say because it was true. "Roy came through a station like yours," he said. "Different war, same work." He talked about the people who put him back together his whole life. Told me once he'd finally met one back home and nobody around here had the first idea who she was. He let that sit. I'm Harlan Voss. I had the honor of Roy's unit for 11 years. Colonel retired. And then he said loud, now turned half toward the churchyard, so it reached the back row, so it reached my father. "This is Captain Della Sizemore, United States Army Nurse Corps. She kept men alive with her hands who had no business living. I've signed letters to mothers that she made unnecessary." He didn't salute me. I want to be exact about that because it's the truest part. A retired colonel does not salute a captain, and Harlan Voss was not a man who got ranks wrong. He did something else. He reached into his coat pocket and he took out a coin. A unit coin worn smooth, the kind that gets carried for decades, and passed hand to hand between people who were there, and he took my hand. The one that had been on the casket, and he pressed that coin into my palm and closed my fingers over it with both of his hands. Then he shook that same hand once, the way you shake the hand of somebody you consider a peer. That's all. That's the whole thing. A coin and a handshake between two soldiers in the grass. If you know what that coin means, you already have chills. If you don't, it is not a medal, and it is not a salute. It is the oldest quiet currency the Army has, and you cannot buy one, and you cannot fake one. And when a man like that puts one in your hand in front of your whole hometown, he is saying, "I was there, and she is one of us, and I will vouch for her with the thing I can't get back if I'm wrong." I looked past his shoulder at my father while it was happening. I couldn't help it. The toothpick was gone. It had fallen out of his mouth. I actually saw it happen, saw it drop into the grass by his shoe, and he did not reach down for it. Wendell Sizemore stood in that churchyard with his mouth a little open, and his story the almost soldier half a century of "Tosor, I nearly went in myself." And there was no room left in the air for it. For the first time in my life, I watched my father have nothing to say. And Rhoda. Rhoda had told me on a porch 8 months before, "Nobody around here would salute you anyway." She was standing 30 feet away, and she'd heard every word, and she'd watched a colonel cross a churchyard to close my hand around a coin, and I saw the exact second the sentence she'd said came back on her because her face did something complicated and then just went still. I didn't feel triumph. I want to tell you I did, because that's the version that would play well, but it isn't what happened. What I felt was the strangest, saddest kind of relief that it had taken a stranger, a dying man's friend I'd never met to say, in 10 seconds, the thing my own father couldn't say in 14 years. I got the thing I'd wanted my whole life standing in that grass. I just got it from the wrong hands. Boss nodded at me once and walked back to the third row and sat down like nothing had happened, because to a man like him, nothing much had. And the service went on. Taps played. They lowered Roy Baker into the ground. But 140 people had seen it. And that was the problem my father woke up to the next morning. Not that his daughter had a coin in her pocket, but that everyone he'd ever told his story to had watched the truth arrive from somewhere he couldn't argue with. What do you do in a town that small the morning after everyone finds out at once? The morning after a thing like that, a small town does its accounting quietly. Nobody calls a meeting. It just happens in parking lots and on porches, one small door closing at a time. Here's what I saw. The first was in the church lot, that same Saturday before we'd even left the burial. I was walking Junie to the car, and I could see my father across the gravel, heading for his truck, and I watched two men fall into his path. Elmore Dietz and a man I only knew as Tuck, both of them men who'd stood in my father's yard 100 times and nodded along to the almost soldier story like it was scripture. My father raised a hand to them, the way he always did, and they didn't stop. They didn't cut him. Nothing that clean. They just kept their heads down and their pace up and let a little too much room open between themselves and him, and were suddenly very interested in getting to their own trucks. My father stood by his open driver's door, with his hand still half up in a churchyard lot emptying out around him, and nobody came to fill the space. I'll tell you what I noticed, and I hate that I noticed it. His hands. There was a streak of grease along the side of one. He'd been under a mower engine that week. He was always under some engine. And when I saw that grease, something came up in me I didn't ask for. Because when I was 9, I had a bicycle with a bent fork the night before a county spelling bee I was terrified of, and I went to bed sure I couldn't ride it there. And in the morning, it was standing by the front door straight, the fork hammered true, and there was grease on the handlebars where his hands had been. He never said a word about it. Never said, "Good luck." Never said, "I fixed it." Just did it in the dark and put it by the door. That was the whole vocabulary of love the man had, and it was real, and I stood in that church lot watching the town step around him, and I hated that the bicycle came back to me right then. It would have been so much easier if he'd only ever been cruel. He wasn't only cruel. That's the part that costs you. I didn't go to him. I want to be honest, this isn't the version where I cross the lot and we reconcile in the gravel. I put my daughter in the car. But I saw it and I've carried it, and there's a difference between hating a man and being free of him, and I found out that morning I was closer to the second than I'd thought. The second door was Rhoda's a week later on my father's own porch. I'd come by to pick up a dish of Junie's she'd left, and Rhoda was there, and she had the house keys in her hand. The ring she'd carried at her hip for 4 years, the one that jingled when she moved, the one that meant, "I'm the one who stayed." And I watched my sister set that ring down on the porch table between us. She said she needed a break. She said it careful, not looking at me, that she'd been carrying him a long time and she was tired and she needed some weeks. Which was true, all of it, but we both knew the keys had meant something more than errands, and setting them down in front of me meant something more than a vacation. The role she'd built the daughter who sacrificed the one who was here. It only worked as long as I was the one who'd run off and abandoned him. A colonel in a churchyard had rearranged who'd abandoned whom, and Rhoda couldn't hold the old shape anymore, so she set it down. And here's where I have to be fair to her, because I promised I would. When I had Junie a hard berth 6 hours from home, my father wouldn't come. It was Rhoda who got in her car at midnight and drove those 6 hours and sat in a hospital hallway till morning in a plastic chair so that when they finally let someone back, there was family. She never brought it up after. Most people would have. She just did it and drove home. I looked at those keys on the table, and I remembered the hallway, and I understood that my sister was not a villain. She was a person who'd been handed one role in a family and had played it too long and too hard, and was now standing in the wreckage of it with no idea who she was supposed to be instead. I didn't have anything to give her for that. I just picked up Junie's dish and told her to take all the weeks she needed, and I meant it. The third thing wasn't a door closing. It was one opening, and it was the smallest of the 3. And it's the one I think about most. I was at the diner in town, the one on the square. Bad coffee been there my whole life a couple weeks on, having lunch alone. And an old man I did not know got up from the counter and came over to my booth. Vietnam by his age and his cap. He didn't sit. He didn't ask me anything. He put one hand on my shoulder, just set it there for a second, the way you'd steady something, and then he took it back and walked out without a word. I never got his name. He'd heard is all. In a town that size, everybody had heard by then, and this was his way of saying the thing there wasn't a word for. And that was when I understood something had actually shifted in me, because a year before, that old man's hand on my shoulder would have meant everything. It would have been the recognition I'd been starving for, and it was good it landed. I won't pretend it didn't, but I didn't need it the way I would have needed it before. I wasn't waiting at the door anymore for the town to decide I was real. Somewhere in the last few weeks, I'd stopped taking attendance on who believed me, which left exactly one person unaccounted for. The town had done its quiet math. My sister had set down her keys. A stranger had put his hand on my shoulder, and the one nod I'd spent my whole life angling for, the one from a man one road over with grease on his hands, still hadn't come. And by then, I honestly didn't know anymore whether I was still waiting for it or whether I'd want it if it came. I finished Roy's story on his porch, so it's the right place to end mine. It was a Sunday afternoon a few weeks after the diner. Junie was out on the back steps with a coloring book working on a fox. Always a fox, that kid, with her tongue stuck out the corner of her mouth in concentration. And a truck pulled into the drive, and it was my father. He didn't come to the door. He got out, and he stood looking at the back steps for a minute at the bottom step that had been split and rocking since spring, the one I kept meaning to fix. And then he went to his truck bed and got a pry bar and a board and a handful of screws, and without a word to me or to Junie, he got down on his knees in my yard and started pulling the broken step. I stood at the screen door and watched him work. He didn't say he was sorry. I've stopped expecting the man to hand me a sentence he doesn't own. He said it the only way he had ever known how, in the dark at a door with grease on his hands, fixing a thing so the person he couldn't talk to wouldn't stumble on it. It wasn't the apology I'd wanted my whole life. It was the one he had. I decided standing at that screen to let it be enough, not because he'd earned it, but because I was done spending my life at the door, waiting for a bigger one. Junie came inside while he worked and climbed into my lap, and she watched him through the glass, and she asked me why Papa was fixing our step, and I heard myself say it. Roy's sentence the third time it came to me, wearing its last face. Because being right isn't the same as being seen, baby. Some people never learn to say it out loud. Doesn't mean they don't see you. And as I said it, I understood I wasn't talking about him anymore. I was talking to her. Being seen was never a thing I could win from anybody in that churchyard or that yard. It was a thing I already had and got to hand to her, and she'd never have to stand at a door for it the way I did. That's the whole story. Before I go, 3 things I know now that I didn't. 1. You don't need the person who refuses to see you to admit they were wrong. Their blindness was never your evidence. What you did stayed true the entire time they couldn't look at it. 2. The truest work is often the work you can never explain to a neighbor, to a table, to your own father. Do it anyway. It doesn't need a witness to have been real. 3. Being right and being seen are 2 different things, and only one of them is ever yours to keep. Stop trading the one you own for the one you're begging for. My father fixed the step. It doesn't rock anymore. Junie runs down it a dozen times a day and never thinks about it, which is, I suppose, what he was after. If this reached you, say so, below. That's all.